Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. This afternoon, the Narendra Modi government presented its first railway budget. It was a keenly awaited event because it's the first chance to glimpse the broad economic direction in which the Prime Minister will take the country. Consequently, there were huge expectations. But has the railway budget lived up to all the hopes centered around it? Or is it a disappointment? In a very real sense, that's the key question we shall try and answer over the next 1 hour. And now joining me to discuss the Modi government's first railway budget is a panel of experts who have great knowledge and understanding of the railways. They are former Railway Minister Dinesh Trivedi, former Chairman of the Railway Board K.C. Jaina, former Member Traffic of the Railway Board V.N. Mathur, former Advisor to the Railway Ministry Sudhindra Kulkarni, and the spokesman of the Gujarat BJP and a former member of the Gujarat government, Karan Thapar. Gentlemen, before we come to details and specifics, let me start with a couple of general questions. Dinesh Trivedi, a lot was expected from Mr. Modi's first railway budget. In your eyes, has it lived up to those expectations, or are you this evening a disappointed man?
You know, just to be fair to Mr. Gaura, who is a very good friend of mine, he has just taken up the job. But very honestly, to tell you my personal feeling, is a great opportunity lost. Because BJP had everything going for them. They have the numbers. I have no doubt they have the intention also. But you know, current presentation of budget, the choice was whether incremental change or a generational change. To me, this is not even an incremental change. And please understand, I am not on politics of it. Budget could have easily added 2.5 percentage point to the national GDP, which has not lived up to that expectation. So, I am personally quite disappointed.
Sudhindra Kulkarni, let me put a very similar question to you and once again still speak in general terms. Does this budget lay out a vision for the future and a roadmap for fulfilling that vision? Or is it full of detail, but somehow does it fall short of a big picture?
Of course, it falls short of the big picture. And I agree with Dinesh ji. I agree with Dinesh ji that it is an opportunity lost in terms of presenting to the nation the vision of the new government. Maybe because they had only 1 month to prepare for the budget. But look at the vagueness in terms of resource mobilization. Just one example. The big idea in this budget is the diamond quadrilateral, you know, which is a counterpart of the golden quadrilateral that Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji implemented. The cost of the diamond quadrilateral high-speed rail network is 9 lakh crore. And what is it that the government, the minister has earmarked for this? 100 crore. He says that bulk of it will come from PPP. But in the budget itself, there is no clear framework for PPP. You know, he mentions that last year, the PPP target was not reached. If it was not reached last year, how is it going to be reached this year?
Okay.
It's quite vague. The second big disappointment is that this budget has no idea whatsoever for the much needed structural reforms in the railway ministry. Without these deep going radical structural reforms in the railway ministry, many of these ideas will only remain ideas.
Sudhindra, let me stop you there and bring in Narayan Vyas, because I still want to get him to respond in general terms before I come to specifics. Mr. Vyas, you're hearing two people with great knowledge of the railway system say that this budget is an opportunity loss, it is lacking in vision, it is vague. How do you respond to that general belief that this budget could have done so much more, but it's failed to do it?
Well, Karan, I have great respect for both these gentlemen, Dinesh Bhai as well as Sudhinji, and I have great regards for the kind of insights and knowledge that they have in the railways in particular. However, I for one would not agree for simply that those kind of makeover provisions could have made this budget little more attractive. But let us understand that over last 10 years, there were 99 projects which appeared in the budget with a total outlay of 60,000 crores, and out of that only one is implemented, Karan, so far. In 10 years, 99 projects, 60,000 crore outlay, one implemented. Now compared to that, if you have 8 months on hand, if you make some kind of a very ambitious provisions, and you are not going to be utilizing them, I think it would have go waste. 100 crore should not be looked at 100 crore as such. You know,
okay.
the Dinesh Bhai would agree with me that once you have a token provision in the budget, it doesn't go as a new item, and you have always a chance to make it up at the time of reappropriation or the revised budget. So I think this is just made a token provision. I am sure as and when it is required during these 8 months time, the further supplementation of the resources could be done, because it's a budgetary item now.
Okay.
So I don't think that one should look at it in a limited context of 100 crore. It's a provision made which goes into the budget endorsing this golden quadrilateral project, diamond quadrilateral project. So I think...
Let me stop you there, Mr. Vyas. I want to now move away from general broad perspectives of the budget to specifics, and let me start with you, Mr. Jaina. Let's come to what the budget first says about the state of the railways that the Modi government has inherited. Mr. Gowda says, it says that the tariff policy so far has lacked what he calls a rational approach. Mr. Gowda says passenger losses have increased, revenues have been frittered away, and he actually used the words mismanagement and apathy has characterized the way the railways have been run. As the former chairman of the railway board, do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, to a certain extent I will agree, because the fact remains that the railways, you see, the fundamental problem with the railways has been the cross subsidizing the passenger fare with the freight fare. With this sort of a thing, obviously this, to maintain a balance, we have been trying to increase the freight rates to take care of this, and every time this is happening, actually the freight is running away from the railways, and this is a very big disaster. But that is the real cause for today's position for the Indian Railways has reached, and therefore to that extent I do agree with him.
In fact, on that very point, Mr. Mathur, as someone who's been member traffic, not just is the freight running away from the railways, as Mr. Jaina puts it, but in fact the railways only carry 31% of all freight by all modes. And yet one would imagine the railways ought to be the biggest carrier of freight in the country. And secondly, the railway share of freight is steadily declining rather than increasing. Is that in a sense a second critical problem with the state of the railways Mr. Modi has inherited?
I think that is a serious problem, because progressively the market share of the railways has been declining, although the total volumes of traffic has been increasing. And I think the objective in the 12th five-year plan is to try and increase market share by 2% annually. For that, the railways really has to diversify the commodities it carries. Today it is confined to only bulk cargo. The new kind of traffic, which are finished products, need to also move by rail. That can only be done through containerization, and I think the railways have not been dealing very fairly with some of the private container train operators. You have to make container movement on the railways attractive so that more investment comes in that area. So yes, I agree, it is a problem that the market share of the railways is declining.
Now, Mr. Trivedi, I address this question to you as a former railway minister. A third problem with the state of the railways Mr. Modi has inherited is the manner in which projects are being sanctioned but simply not completed. Apparently, in the last 10 years, 676 projects were sanctioned, worth a total of 1,57,000 crore, 317 completed, but 359 incomplete, and there are 4 projects which are more than 30 years old and are not completed either. This clearly suggests that ministers have been sanctioning projects, putting money behind them and allowing that money to go waste. That's another problem with the state of the railways Mr. Modi has inherited. Would you agree, or would you as a former minister disagree?
No, I mean, there's no question of not agreeing. Karan, I must tell you, if you go through the speeches of all the railway ministers, Every railway minister, when they make this budget speech, including me, have said this, that look here, I can't deliver. It's difficult. So, to address this question, I must tell you that we have not understood the Indian Railways. And you have some experts sitting on the panel. We have the best of the people in the world with Indian Railways. Believe me, right from the gangman to the boat people, they are fantastic, the best brains. Only thing is, if we do not give them resource, how do you expect them to deliver? So what is the answer? Answer number one, depoliticize Indian Railways. Don't give budget for 1 year. If there is any planning required, there has to be a 10-year planning. Like the defense, like the foreign, you must have one Indian Railway national policy. With the change of the government, with the change of the board member, with the change of the minister, the policy will not change. And everybody has to be taken on board. Otherwise, we'll go through the incremental change. Nothing will happen. Railway is absolutely a great asset. And what we are talking about is investment. Just to give you an example, China has 116 billion US dollar outlay. We have 10 to 12. Because railway can add through the freight system 2.5% to the GDP.
Okay.
And if you deploy and invest money today, after 10 years, you will get such a fantastic return directly or indirectly. Take the question of Swiss Railway. They are also losing, but indirectly they are making so much of money as far as the economy is concerned. We are absolutely behind the modern railways, and you need to have a total generational change. Whether the bullet train comes or not,
let me stop you there.
Reinforce your structure.
Let me stop you there. I'll come in a moment's time to the fact that changes we need to make. I still want to continue with a certain analysis of the state of the railways inherited by Mr. Modi, because the first part of this railway budget speech that attracted attention was the very honest depiction of the dire state of the railway. Sudhindra Kulkarni, something else that Mr. Gowda said which attracted attention was that of every rupee that the railway spends, 94 paisa is in fact spent on maintenance. Only 6 paisa is left for surplus, which means the railways simply do not have the internal resources for growth. However they find it is another question, but the dire state of the railways is that they only have 6% of what they earn available for their own growth. That's another indication of the very poor health of the railways today. Would you accept that?
Yeah, Sadanand Gowda was a good doctor as far as diagnosing the problem is concerned, but his prescription did not go far enough to really address all the problems that he himself identified in the first part of the budget. Let me give an example. I mentioned that it's not just the funds crunch, the resource crunch that's the problem of Indian Railways. It is also the system of governance which is outmoded, which is insular, which is inefficient. Last year, in March 2013, China simply disbanded the Ministry of Railways and converted it into China Railway Corporation. So what Dinesh Bhai is saying, a continuity of policy, irrespective of the change of government. Of course, there is no change of government in China, but in the Indian context, what is it that's going to give continuity of policy? It is when governments cannot interfere, and that is what corporatization does. Whereas this government has so far not shown the boldness to change the governance structure of Indian Railways.
Okay, let me pick up on that first thought and put it to you, Mr. Vyas. You've heard Sudhindra Kulkarni, a former colleague of yours, once upon a time a member of the BJP, say that Mr. Gowda is a great doctor, his diagnosis of the ailment is perfect, but his prescription and his cure is sharply lacking. Now, one of the things that in fact Mr. Gowda has suggested, and that's one of the targets he set himself, is to make the railways the largest freight carrier in the world. But has he failed to say how he'll do this? It seems to me all he's done is to put out an intent without actually drawing a roadmap for how he achieves it. Therefore, this intent, you either have to accept on trust because you have no other basis for doing so.
Well, Karan, I think it will be totally unfair to make this kind of a sweeping statement and brand him as a doctor who has written his prescription well, but he has some other problems. You know, look at this. I'm just giving you one example, and I think Sudhinji will be able to appreciate that. Gowda talks about 11,000 unmanned level crossings and the safety at these unmanned level crossings. And then in the same breath, he says 1,700 crores for this year, which is 8 months.
Stop you? My question was a specific question about how does Mr. Gowda intend to make the railways the largest freight carrier in the world. That's an intent he's expressed clearly, but he hasn't got a roadmap for achieving it. So are we to simply take it on faith and trust?
Well, I'll come to that, Karan, slightly later. I'm just completing this argument. You know, the lives lost, which was 0.02 per million passengers traveling in 2001, has gone up to 0.126. That has gone up 6 times. While the number of accidents have decreased, the lives lost have gone up 6 times, and most of them are other than railway employees' faults that people have lost their lives. So I think he has prescribed it well, and he has also made adequate remedy by making those 1,700 crore provisions.
One got a roadmap for how he wants to do it. He simply expressed his intent and stopped at that. Is that adequate?
Well, I think it is not going to happen just in this next 8 months' time. He has another 4 years to sort of build upon these whatever experiments he is making. And then when he comes up for the full year budget, maybe all these kinds of things where you are going to think out of box can come. But I also again beg to differ with the member traffic. Yes, 31% as the share of the freight is a concern. Market share must increase, it's also agreeable. But then, in a country when you are talking about railways freight share much higher, it was a monopolistic situation, roads were not well developed, you didn't have carriers, and so many other factors are there. Today you are in a competitive market, and the packages also have changed.
Us, Mr. Vyas, the member traffic made a specific point about freight coming down because you were increasing freight charges and using those to subsidize passenger charges. You were losing on the passenger front and you were pricing your freight out of the business. So he made a different point. Let's not confuse it. Let me come back to this question of making the railways the largest freight carrier.
No,
what does he need to do it? Because he hasn't said anything in the budget about what steps he plans to take. He simply expressed an intent and left it hanging in the air.
To carry on, you see the discussion that is going on. Actually, on a first hearing of the railway minister, I also felt that it was only a wish list being read out with a certain roadmap being shown for implementation. But actually, it is slightly not understood, because when just before coming here, I had a chance to look at the budget papers. I was surprised to find that the fund allocation actually is a real pointer to the intention that he has, which I was really surprised to find. So therefore, honestly, I have not studied it fully, but a little I can only mention to you. I found that in the fund allocation, it has been very wisely thought of.
Stick for a moment to this question about making the railways the largest freight carrier. Is that a credible intent?
Yeah. You see, 30. He has been able to prioritize those sectors that are going to help the Indian Railways to move traffic, because that is what is important today. Today the freight is not moving because the capacity has been completely finished. You see, last 5 years we have run 700 additional new trains. So therefore, it has totally choked the system. And therefore, today the only way out is that we go back and create the capacity that we need. And therefore, I found there is at least an intention to prioritize those areas, because...
Before you bury me with detail, I'm going to ask you a simple question. You therefore believe that the intention to make the railways the largest freight carrier is a credible intention and one that he's done enough in this budget to support?
No. See, that's the second part, is that to make it credible or to use it, so we have to talk of resource mobilization, which is...
Give me a short, sharp answer, because audiences will get lost in detail. No. What is it that he hasn't done that would make it credible if he had done it? Give me 2 examples.
Fundamentally, you see, he has over-dependence on PPP is a factor which I doubt.
Right.
But I do not know unless this government is able to find some way for the PPP, because the last 5 years that we have done, PPP has not succeeded.
Another element in this budget which is also to do with PPP is the incredible interest that people have taken in the claim that, one, he will set up a diamond quadrilateral of high-speed trains, and he's also announced the first bullet train to run on the Mumbai-Ahmedabad sector. Now, when it comes to financing that, and this is a point in a sense you heard from Sudhindra Kulkarni a moment ago, there's absolutely nothing. We know that the total cost of the quadrilateral is 9 lakh crore. We know that the single bullet train will be 60,000 crore. But the budget simply talks about an initial allocation of 100 crore, and presumably that's just for surveys and tests, full stop. And then it says PPP will take up the rest. But if PPP hasn't succeeded up to now in the preceding years, does he not need to take steps to make PPP credible, to invite investors to come? Will FDI, will PPP simply come because the minister says we need you, or does he need to do more to invite them and encourage them?
I think I'd agree with what many of the other speakers have said. The budget announcements in terms of a future path or a future vision are commendable, but they are lacking in detail. And I do hope, the government has had a very short time, just about a month, and I do hope in the coming months the details will be worked out. Let me give you the example of public-private partnership. I have run a public-private partnership company for 5 years after I retired from the railways, and in those 5 years the kind of hurdles that we have faced, the kind of resistance that has come from the railways.
This is bureaucratic resistance.
Bureaucratic resistance has been amazing. So I think the details do matter, and I do hope they will be able to smoothen out all the problems that public-private partnership have faced in the last 7-8 years in India. No private capital has come to Indian Railways, whereas in the port sector it is about 80%. In the airport sector it has been 60% during the 11th
But
five-year
zero
plan.
in the railways.
It is 4% in the railways.
And what you're saying is that the biggest obstacle to FDI and PPP in the railways is the bureaucratic hurdles. Is the bureaucratic hurdles.
And smoothening out the concession agreements and the models and so on.
In other words, bureaucracy, red tape, and all the other procedural delays that afflict working with government wherever you work with the government.
So one very good announcement which I would like to mention is, which Mr. Kulkarni commented on, was he has mentioned restructuring of the railway board.
I'll come to restructuring in a moment's time. I'll come to that in a moment's time. Let me come back to you again, Mr. Dinesh Trivedi, because one of the things that has caught a great deal of attention is that bullet train. It's captured the imagination of the press. Now, that is entirely dependent, as is the whole of the rest of the Diamond Quadrilateral, on the attraction of FDI. In fact, sources are now letting it be known that the minister says that, in fact, the bullet train will be entirely financed by FDI. But FDI will look for returns when they come. And the bullet train is extremely expensive. If the bullet train is to yield returns, it means the pricing of the tickets on the bullet train will be extremely expensive. In which case, how many people will be able to travel by it? But if the government seeks to subsidize it, to make it more affordable, then either foreign investors won't be interested, or the government will have an enormous burden to carry. So is there a whole area of conceptualization around the bullet train and its financing that needs to be clarified and thought out? It sounds interesting and enticing, but perhaps it becomes messy when you go into the details. Is that a correct view?
Let me tell you, Karan, with whatever little exposure experience I have, I was in touch with the Japanese government and the Prime Minister himself on the Shinkansen or the bullet train. My view was very simple. I have no money. You do the survey, you build, you operate. You do everything, and after 30-40 years you give it back to me. And the fact is, there is no iota of doubt, Indian Railways at this point in time is just not possible, because 60,000 crore, you require 125 crore for 1 kilometer. And how are you going to acquire the land? How are you going to make sure that the level crossings are in place? How are you going to make sure, on one side you are talking about bullet train, on the other side people are traveling on the roof of the train. Both the things cannot go hand in hand. So my suggestion is, infrastructure you strengthen and make sure that you are one of the most modern trains in the country. And by all means then go for bullet train. Bullet train can only come on the existing track, which has to be elevated. So you are not coming in front of any level crossing. It has to be elevated, and the cost is going to be much more than maybe 125 crore.
Can I stop you there? As a former chairman of the railways, can the bullet train actually exist on existing tracks, or do you need a whole new track?
So the whole concept is that, you see, it has to be on a dedicated track. It cannot be on an existing track at all. Because the fundamental part, as you rightly said, Mr. Trivedi was mentioning, you have to barricade the track, you have to, there can be no level crossing at all on this route. And in fact, you have to totally avoid even cattle coming onto the track.
So it cannot be on existing tracks?
No, absolutely not.
Sudhindra Kulkarni, you know, the bullet train is one of those ideas that has caught the imagination of the press. It's bound to be over the front pages tomorrow. But let me put this to you. Financing of the bullet train is going to be a terrible problem, because if you're relying on FDI, foreign investors will want to return. If they want to return, they'll charge high prices. If they charge high prices, Indians won't be able to travel. On the other hand, if the government starts subsidizing it to make it affordable, the government will end up with a deficit burden that it doesn't want. But there are also problems to do with the acquisition of land. There are problems to do with the building of the tracks. Is this a great idea, but possibly a mistaken idea for India?
No, it's a great idea for an aspirational India. The fact that we have started talking about a bullet train is something that will push us towards its implementation. How we will implement it, of course, is still unclear. And I agree again with Dinesh Bhai that the railways simply do not have the resources to fund it. It has to be completely a different route, perhaps leveraging the value of the land adjacent to the bullet train. That can perhaps be a source of funding of the bullet train concept, but it is not really a priority for India. There are other priorities which need to be pushed aggressively, and for doing so, I once again come back to this point that we need, just imagine, Karan, would we have had this big change in civil aviation, both in terms of the aircraft as well as airport infrastructure, had it remained a monopoly of the Airport Authority of India or Air India? We have seen this big change in just the past 10 years because the entire sector was opened up.
Can I stop you a moment?
Railways, in contrast,
Can I stop you a moment?
Is a closed sector today.
Can I stop you a moment? I want to pick up on something you said and elaborate on it before I come to your idea of corporatization and opening up the railways to what is in effect going to be privatization. You also said that the bullet train is not a priority. Are you suggesting Mr. Gowda's got his priorities slightly confused and mixed up? A short, quick answer to that.
Is it a question for me?
Yes, it is, Sudhindra. Go ahead. It is for you.
Yeah. I meant, when I say that it's not a priority, I mean, it is not something that can be taken up in the next 8 months, or for that matter, even in the coming few years.
Okay.
There are more pressing challenges before Indian Railways, which have been well documented, well stated by the minister in today's
Let me bring in Jay Narayan Vyas.
The mind space of the government.
Let me bring in Jay Narayan Vyas. This is an idea that is going to catch the attention of the press. It's an idea that certainly has caught the imagination of middle class India. We all want to see bullet trains. We dream that we're in Japan, or we dream that we're in China when we sit in a bullet train. But what about the point made by Sudhindra Kulkarni? This is not a priority. It's not a priority over the next 1 year, 2 years, even 3 years. And that there are many other challenges that should have been the key concern for the minister. How do you respond to that?
Well, I would tend to agree with Sudhinji as far as the concern, and therefore my personal belief is that the PPP model, where you are supposed to bring in your share also on the table, will not work here. It has to go under build, operate, transfer model, where you don't invest anything, you are tactically supporting the entire program, and the entire money that is required, or the resources these are required, come from a private entrepreneur, either through FDI route or any other mode of finance. And then after 30 years, 40 years, or whatever is the time frame, because these kind of projects will take long payback period, it is handed over back to the railways. So I don't think initially it will not need any funding of a very large magnitude, and if it is to come through budgetary support, I 100% agree with Sudhinji that it will not materialize. Your priorities are elsewhere, social sectors require a lot of funds, and I think this is not the case. BOT model is the ideal thing in this case to go for.
Well, let me put that to you. I would ask both of you two short, sharp questions and ask you for short answers. First of all, do you believe India will attract sufficient FDI, A, for the bullet train, and B, for the whole diamond quadrilateral?
See, as
and I'm asking that question in the light of the bureaucratic hassles and concerns that put off PPP. That puts off Indians from coming in. What about foreigners and FDI?
No, see, as chairman of the UIC, which I was holding for 2 years, I had discussed this subject with a large number of countries.
What was their answer?
No. So they were prepared to do the work, as long as funding, even they're prepared to advance the fund and do the work, but not operate, because
but they're not allowed to operate under FDI.
That is as per FDI. And second part also was the tariff risk, because they were not sure as to whether the government of India would agree to a tariff which they would fix.
So they want a guarantee on tariff to ensure that their investment gets a return.
Exactly. So
is that an easy guarantee for any Indian government to give?
No, I do not think so under the present circumstances, because see, today you hear the people, they're all very euphoric about the bullet train, but not realizing what it will cost them.
So when you come to the affordability of the actual ticket on a bullet train, the concept becomes very questionable.
Yeah, because as per my...
am I right in that?
Our work, I'll just give you this thing. See, normal today our cost of your passenger fare is 1 rupee or 1.50 paisa per kilometer, while the bullet train would cost 7 rupees per kilometer or more.
Which either Indians can't afford, or the government will have to subsidize, and if it subsidizes it, it ends up with a deficit.
No. See, fundamentally again, it's the wrong thing. These type of service is not meant for a traveler of the normal type. It is meant for business travelers, because you see the time that you are saving.
So it's an elite concept for the rich.
It's a totally business. No, it's not rich. It's a business travel. Because
business people in India tend to be rich.
That's a different matter.
Okay. Let me bring you in and put the second key question to you. We've talked about two key targets that Mr. Gowda has identified. The first is to make the railways the largest freight carrier in the world. And we came to the conclusion that all he's done is to express intent. He hasn't got a roadmap for how he's going to do it. And then there were lots of other problems about the bureaucratic hassles and concerns, the funding and the PPP. The second great target he set himself was the diamond quadrilateral of high-speed trains and the specific bullet train that he wants to build Ahmedabad, Bombay. And once again, we've come to the conclusion that he's not likely to attract the FDI or the PPP partnerships because of bureaucratic concerns. But when it comes to FDI, there will also be concerns about the tariff that will be charged and whether the Indian government will bite the bullet of the tariff that should be charged. Do you therefore think that when it comes to those two ideas, the budget is enticing, it will attract headlines in the papers tomorrow, but actually it's not fully, properly thought out?
I think the government is very keen on bringing in the bullet train. In some ways, I would agree with them, because you can't fall behind countries like Turkey, and China has got 10,000 kilometers of high-speed lines. So therefore, India needs to develop a railway, a bullet train on the Bombay-Ahmedabad, as they have announced. It really depends on how you structure the project. The project will have to be split into components. It is the physical infrastructure, that is the embankment and the rail, and the operating portion, the rolling stock and the operations of that. So if you can split it, then perhaps some portion can attract either PPP or foreign direct investment.
Only if you split it?
If you have to, you will have to divide it. The project as a whole might be very difficult, but I wish for foreign direct investment, he had announced additional freight corridors, because freight corridors are very viable propositions.
And free of some of the hassles that are connected with passenger fares and passenger
that
tariffs.
Kind of thing.
Let me put that to you as a politician, Dinesh Trivedi. Many of the challenges behind either making the railways the largest freight carrier in the world, or the diamond quadrilateral, or the bullet train, is the funding. And the key challenge there is, how do you attract FDI given the bureaucratic hassles in India, given the tariff concerns? Now, you're a politician, and it's politicians who reach out and invite foreign investors. If you were railway minister today, what message would you have that would encourage FDI to come in and back up both the freight development as well as the Diamond Quadrilateral?
See, as far as the foreign investor is concerned, if I were to invest, I want to see the durability and the longevity. That is why I said with the change of minister and the government, you can't change the policies. And these are all very long-term investments. First of all, the practical solution is no country can develop if your freight haulage is not efficient. I'll just give you a comparison of US. 5 ton, 5 horsepower per tonnage they carry. As far as we are concerned, it is 0.8. So you have got to build up your capacity with larger carriage, larger haulage capacity. It means 1200 horsepower engines. Your train has to be longer. So your answer to your question is, an investor will need a long term, and they must be absolutely certain that midway things will not change. So they require guarantees, and this will not work. Even the private terminal people who had come, they are running away because the trust deficiency is missing out here. Tomorrow there is going to be dharna. That is why take all the political parties together and then only go forward for 10 years. Otherwise it will not happen.